As always, we greet those in our presence and those who are not within range of our voices at this moment with a good morning.
Good morning.
And so all those who may hear this tape are brought into fellowship with us in this greeting. First of all, as you know, the main purpose of the message of the Infinite Way is to reveal the truth of being, so that through some knowledge of the letter of truth, we may come into the actual consciousness of truth. The letter of truth itself is only important insofar as it leads us to an awareness, to a consciousness of truth itself. In the measure that we attain that consciousness of truth, in the measure, in the degree that it fills our being, just in that degree do we fulfill or find fulfilled in us Paul's statement that I live, yet not I, Christ liveth in me. There is a point of transition where we pass from living our own lives, making our own decisions, being concerned with our own affairs, to a place in consciousness where something takes over. That something the Master called the Father within. He doeth the works. And Paul called the Christ. I can do all things through Christ. Other revelators in other languages have called it by other names. But probably for us, the Father within or the Christ will do. Emmanuel, God with us. In any event, let us understand clearly that affirming, stating, or even thinking that Christ dwells in us, or that the presence goes before us to make the crooked places straight, let us remember always that these statements, affirmations, readings, quotations, will do nothing for us, and they themselves are not power. The constant remembrance of them, the continuous bringing them to light within our consciousness, will lead us to that point of transition where it takes over. Then it is no more necessary to make such statements as it would be to walk around and say, I am honest, I am fair, I am just, I am moral. We always suspect the fellow whose name is Honest John. And certainly we would all suspect ourselves if we found it necessary to walk around saying, I am honest or I am just. And so it is the time comes when it is no longer necessary for us to say or declare or even think, I am spiritual, or I am spirit, or I am the child of God, or I am God. Those things just automatically drop away when the consciousness itself takes over, when the Spirit itself begins to live our lives. Now, we have entered a new era in world's history. It has been coming on for a long, long time. I believe that there are pyramid prophecies to the effect that this new era should begin on August 20th, 1953, or August 20th, 2053. I believe the authorities on the pyramids are not quite certain whether the date is 1953 or 100 years later, but they are agreed that the spiritual era is ushered in within this 100-year period. In 1951, I said in a class that this era of world peace would begin on August 20th, 1953. And certain it is that between August 16th and August 20th, something very vital happened, not only in my experience, but in the experience of several of our students, indicating that some new activity had begun in consciousness. Since then, also, I find a little difference in my mail. I have a letter from the editor, or an editor, of a newspaper, telling me that her publishers have notified her that there is to be an increase in the coverage of religious news, since a recent survey shows that it has become one of the major items in world interest and public interest. Also, a couple of our largest national magazines have recently asked writers for articles of a spiritual nature or on spiritual subjects, and in some cases have even suggested subjects about which they would like writings. From so many different directions, it is evident that whatever it is that people have leaned upon, whether of material nature or mental, or even church, has not met their need. And the desperateness of the world situation is turning them in the direction of what the world calls God. Naturally, at this stage, many will seek in wrong directions. In the end, this will be of no major importance, since it is not the way we go that counts, but the motive that impels us. Regardless of what path we choose, be it ever so erroneous, it will lead us to the kingdom of God. If the motive behind our search is a true motive. We have no better example of that than Saul of Tarsus. Here was a man of great zeal, evidently of a deep desire for truth, for God, a man who was willing to leave his home where he had free citizenship, a man who was willing to mingle his fate with that of the slave Hebrews of the Holy Land, a man who was willing to study, who was humble enough of spirit to place himself under the best teacher available, and surely he filled himself with as much of untruth as could be given him, enough of it to make him a persecutor of truth. And yet we find him one of the great lights of truth, one of the great teachers of truth, certainly one of the great ones of his particular era. We even find him illumined, actually receiving the gift of the Christ itself. And we may ask, why? Why? A man out on a mission of persecution, of destroying the very Christ itself, and he receives it in so large a measure. The answer is the motive that governs his life. We, in this age, give far too much attention to the demonstration of the joys and successes that are to come with this illumination than we do to the illumination itself. Most of the truth students are seeking more of the demonstration of forms of good, expressions of good, than they are in the unfoldment of good itself, God itself. It is natural and it is normal, it is right, that we come into the realization and demonstration of spiritual harmony. But what determines the degree of our success is whether our motive is to leave our nets or to have our nets filled with more fish. Now each one can easily determine that for themselves. This continuous desire to increase the human sense of supply, the human sense of health, the human sense of success, is really an attempt to fill our nets with more fish, or larger fish, or tastier fish. Whereas the spiritual motive is to leave the nets and find the meaning of my kingdom. We have an interesting word there, my. It is particularly interesting in the Gospel of John. My kingdom, my peace I give unto you. My word shall not return void. My kingdom, my truth, my word, my thoughts are not your thoughts. There is a deep spiritual significance in that word my, since, as we ponder it, we come to the realization that this kingdom is nothing that we can ever think of or dream of. That this word, a word of power, is not your word or my word. It is nothing that you think, nothing that you read in a book, nothing that you have heard from another. This my word is only a word that you can hear in your inner ear. You can never hear it from a person. You can never read it in a book. You can only receive it within your own consciousness from the depth of your own being. And when you do, you find it literally true that it is quick and sharp and powerful, that it really does go to the very marrow of the bones, that it divides the Red Sea. You may be assured of this: it is no thought that you think that will do that, and no statement of truth that you know that will do that. It is always a truth that is revealed, received in consciousness from the depth of one's own being. It is for this reason that we, in the infinite way, must go beyond the realm of mind. We must go beyond the realm not only of conscious thinking, but of subconscious thinking. We must go to that realm which is the source or spirit, and there receive our light and our words. Certainly, many words have been printed of the infinite way message, and many, many more have been recorded on tape. But all of these have but one purpose: driving us back into that kingdom within our own being. driving us into that level of consciousness where the truth imparts itself to us. Every word that has been spoken or written in the message of the infinite way has but one intent: to lift our consciousness into an atmosphere where we each individually may receive this impartation. It is particularly necessary at this time that we give some thought to this idea of individual unfoldment. In spiritual illumination, you discover a great truth, and that is that God is all. You discover that God is infinite and omnipresent and omnipotent. You find that God is the law, and in fact the only law, unto all existence, and the substance of all that is, and the activity of all that is. And when you realize that, sometimes some people mount on to cloud 9 and begin a temporary life of God is all. And many have lost their entire demonstration in this lifetime through forgetting that that allness appears to us individually. That allness does not wipe out our individual existence. That allness does not eliminate individual identity. In other words, it would be like saying that the ministry of Jesus Christ was a mistake, because he not only felt that he personally, individually, had received a message and a mission from the Father, but that his purpose on earth was to exemplify the message and the mission. He felt a call to, as he said, heal the sick, raise the dead, teach the gospel, preach the gospel to the poor. He taught this by parables. In one he said, when I was in prison, he comforted, he visited me. When I was sick, he comforted me. I was naked and he clothed me. He gave recognition to the fact that there exists what is called a human existence. Sometimes a very good one, and sometimes a bad one. He gave recognition to the fact that there were Hebrews who had been given freedom and then had been returned to slavery. He gave recognition to the fact that Moses fed the people, yet they afterward hungered. He gave recognition to the fact that there is a state of existence from which we must be awakened, or into which must come spiritual illumination. So too, do we, in the infinite way, understand that God, in the infinity of its being, encompasses nothing of a mortal or material nature, but that there exists what we call a prodigal experience, a sense of selfhood that has wandered from the Father's house, has set up a separate identity called Joel, Bill, Mary, and now has a great deal of trouble in caring for that identity. Having set up this selfhood called Joel, it now has to support itself, has to feed itself, has to find ways and means of clothing and housing itself, maintaining its own health, maintaining its own life. Joel is a great concern to Joel all through Joel's experience. At some period or other, every individual decides that the banquet table is not quite as good as the one that the Father's servant has, and starts this return to divine consciousness. That is the beginning of the path of illumination, the beginning of the path of spiritual realization. And then, if only one can keep their thought away from demonstrating food and rent, and maintain in themselves a hunger and thirst for the Father's house, for divine consciousness, for a realization of spiritual truth, then comes one day this transition into that state of consciousness when the Father consciousness or divine sonship becomes apparent, and it again takes over, and then Joel returns to his rightful estate, that of being a beholder of God revealing itself, of God living its own life, not wiping out Joel, no, but God living its own life in infinite form, infinite variety. Not God appearing only as himself, but God appearing as himself, appearing to us as infinite persons or infinite varieties of flowers or fruit, sun, moon, stars. Believe me, the realization of God will not wipe out sun, moon, stars, fish, plants, or planets, but rather spiritual illumination will reveal God as the individual identity of persons and things and conditions. Probably I emphasize that point today because in recent months several of our students have been given or have received the impression that they can wipe themselves out. They can eliminate themselves because they do not exist. Since God is all, everybody is in heaven. And just remember that you're in heaven, and then you'll wake up and find yourself there. And also that you need not bother healing anybody, because there is nobody to be healed. In other words, wiping out through human words the world of unreality, instead of wiping it out through right identification, and with it wiping out individual identity. Now let us glory in the fact of individual identity, of God appearing as infinite individuality, God appearing as the life and substance of our being. I have said this before, no one should ever call the infinite way teaching an absolute teaching. Firstly, because the word absolute has so many different connotations. And the question would then arise, which one of the absolutes would the infinite way come under? And so it's better not to be known as an absolute teaching. There is so much of the relative in all teachings, and there must be, because as we sit here, we are using human faculties with which to rise above human faculty. We are using the activity of our minds in order to lift ourselves above the very thoughts and fears of the human mind. In other words, the human mind has a legitimate place in our lives. Even in spiritual being, there is that which is called the human mind. It may have a different name in spiritual living, but there is a faculty of awareness. That is what we now call our human mind. It is a faculty of awareness. It is not a creative faculty. It is not something we use to create things with, or conditions, or even to change them, but to become aware of that which is. In other words, the human mind may know that 2 times 2 are 4, but it cannot make it so. The human mind is an instrument through which we may learn that there is a law of like begetting like. But the human mind cannot make it so. As long as it is necessary for us to become aware, there must be a faculty of awareness. In the same way that as long as there is a need for our eating and drinking, there must be those activities which we call digestion, assimilation, elimination. What these will be in spiritual being and body, or how they will appear to us, certainly I know of no one who knows that now. But this we know, that the higher our realization of God, the greater our realization of God as the very life of our being, the greater our realization of that, the more harmonious this mind and body appear to us and function for us. We have not risen above the need of a body, nor of eating, nor of drinking, and therefore we have not risen above the need of harmonious functioning of being and body. Now in this prodigal experience, this sense of humanhood, let me come back a moment. In the degree of our conscious oneness with God, in the degree of our conscious union with God, our minds and bodies function without any awareness that they're functioning. We have not even a knowledge that it's going on. The blood is just flowing and all the organs and functions are operating, and yet not intruding themselves upon our awareness. Then, in this sense of separation, which we call humanhood, there are those in the experience of physical, mental, moral discord, financial too. Wherever there is a sense of separation from God, and in the degree of that sense of separation from God, you will find physical, mental, moral, and financial inharmonies of human relationships of all kinds. In the degree of conscious union with God, harmony is restored. Now, as we in our study, practice, illumination, come into more and more of this spiritual awareness, we find our affairs of mind, body, and being, operating harmoniously, joyously, what we outwardly call successfully, And we find another thing, that those still under the sense of separation, noting the greater harmony in our experience, come to us for help. It is not going to be well to preach to them or to make light of their problems or to make absolute denials that they have any problems or that there is anyone to have a problem, but rather to develop our consciousness to that degree that when they come to us for help, the light of our being dispels that illusory sense of discord and lifts them into an atmosphere of consciousness where they too realize their true identity. Notice for that reason that in our healing work we do very little talking to the one who has asked for help. We do very little of handing out metaphysical cliches, very little of preaching, very little of telling them to think better thoughts or become more loving or just or moral, but rather we devote ourselves to rising above even the physical sense of good, living so far as we can in the spiritual atmosphere of harmony, and then letting these errors of sense be dispelled by contact with our consciousness. As our own lives begin to show forth God's handiwork, does the world come to us for more and more of that experience? It is true that it is well to know the letter of truth and to know it correctly, and to be able to give some measure of reason for our faith. But beware lest the thought ever enter your mind that by voicing these truths or writing them or telling them to the patient or student that you are thereby eliminating the discord. Remember that the elimination of discords in your experience or that of those who come to you is the result of the degree of unity that you experience with the Godhead, the degree of your conscious oneness with God. Now, as we pass through that stage, as we pass through the forms of treatment that are given in the Infinite Way writings and recordings, we come step by step to a higher unfoldment. And then we begin to see that what we have learned is not so much the truth of being as the basis for the consciousness of the truth of being. The reason is this, mark this: everyone has some concept of God. More especially, every metaphysical student or every student of spiritual wisdom has some concept of God. And let it be remembered now that not one of these concepts of God is correct. Not one idea of God that we entertain is correct. Not one definition of God that has ever been given is correct. There is no way to arrive at a concept of God that is correct. God may define itself to us within our own consciousness, so that we may say, too, with the prophets, yes, in my flesh I have seen God face to face. We may, like Abraham, converse with the Father, commune with the Father. We may have as close a relationship as the Master, who definitely had intimate communion with the Father within. And yet, there is no way in which we can define God to another. God is an experience. God is a realization. When we say that God is mind, or God is life, or God is love, we cannot take words like mind, life, love, principle, or soul, or spirit, and use them as if they were synonyms for God. They aren't. A synonym is one word that may take the place of another. But words like spirit, or soul, or mind, or principle are merely descriptive of certain aspects, phases, or facets of God being. To say that God is mind would be to say that God is the source and fount and avenue of intelligence. Yes, that does make God mind, but it doesn't make mind God. Since God also is love. And love includes within itself care, protection, gentleness. So God is love, but love isn't God, because there is more to God than love. And if we were to take God as the sum total of all these, we still would not have the infinite nature of God's being. I think that is a mistake sometimes made, and I get a good deal of it in the mail, with students who write, "Oh, I've realized that I am God." Of course, that couldn't be true. That couldn't be true. The moment we say, "I am God," we are bringing a definite finiteness into being. We can say, "God is my being." God constitutes my being. But then to say that I constitute God's being is a little bit far-fetched. Ah, you say, but if you understood the word "I" correctly. Yes, but if you did, you would never make the statement, "I am God." Because the statement, "I am God," cannot be voiced. It can only be heard. When the voice announces within us, "Be still, and know that I am God," that verily is God. But the moment I say, "I am God," no, that cannot be. That cannot be. There again, we have the need to be watchful, lest we are attempting to make a human being God, or even to feel that the spiritual identity of one constitutes the allness of the Godhead. The allness of the Godhead constitutes individual being. That you will have to wrestle with in your meditation. The allness of the Godhead constitutes individual being. And that is why the voice often comes and says to us, "Know ye not, I am God." The Master understood that when he said, "I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me doeth the work." He knew that when he said, "I and the Father are one, but the Father is greater than I." Now there is no duality there. There is no two-ness there. It is only the degree of consciousness announcing itself. As human beings, we call ourselves human beings, but then we realize, no, We aren't and we never were human beings, and sometime or other, first we may just read it in a book and declare that I am the child of God, I am the son of God, and later we may even come into the consciousness of that fact. And still later we say, why, I am the Christ. Pretty hard statement to make, but it can become true. The day can come when that still small voice announces, I am the Christ. I in the midst of you am the Christ. And there is no reason why that cannot go on until we hear, as the Master did, thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me, for I and the Father are one. And when this higher consciousness takes over and speaks through you, it may truly say, I am God. But let us be watchful that we do not say it out of the mind or with the lips, but if it ever crosses our lips, that it has been pushed through by an inner voice, an inner selfhood that is not impelled by our conscious thinking. Now let us return for a moment to this idea that we cannot define God, describe God, or have even a true concept of God. A concept of God really represents our idea of God, our sense of God, and you can see how that concept would be changing continuously. We may go from Hebrew Scripture, or we may be in the Hebrew Scriptures and declaring the Jehovah God, the God of punishment, the God of reward, the God that goes out with armies and destroys other peoples. That may, for a while, be our concept of God. We may entertain a concept of God that feeds us every day, protects us, but that truly isn't God. There is no such God. That represents our concept of God. Now, unfortunately, that which we call the Christian church today has accepted more of the Judaic God than of the Christian God. I don't know of any Christian church that hasn't accepted the idea of a punishing God and a rewarding God, and of a God of good and evil. All churches, to some extent, accept the God of the Old Testament. Let us move for a moment into the New Testament. And there we find God as Father, God as love, and we entertain those concepts of God and surround those concepts with certain meanings. There are people who think of God as love and then begin to think of all the humanly loving things they can think of and ascribe that to God, not realizing that love, in John's sense of it, had a much higher connotation than anything we can humanly believe. Now, as we progress from the Old Testament to the New, and from the New Testament into metaphysics, and from metaphysics into spiritual wisdom, our concepts of God will change, just as our concepts of prayer will change. And if we are wise, if we have the listening ear, we will be gaining higher and higher concepts of God and of prayer until the day when all concepts disappear and the experience of God takes its place. When that day arrives, the miracle is this, that a realization comes that regardless of what one has thought about God, it isn't true, never was true, and represented only our degree of a spiritual awareness of that particular moment. It is the same with prayer. It is a shocking thing to go through the forms of prayer that we have known. Now I lay me down to sleep, and all the rest of them, to see what concepts of both God and prayer we have entertained, and then ultimately come to the realization that no prayer ever known will influence God. Most prayer is indulged for that purpose, of influencing God, of getting God to do something that God isn't already doing, getting God to do something for someone whom God at the moment is neglecting. Prayer, on the whole, is a means, or accepted as a means, to bringing about God's influence in our individual experience or in the experience of our nation or the world. The chaplains who go to war with us and our allies are praying God for the protection of the men on our side. But the same ministers and rabbis and priests of the same churches are utilizing the same prayer for the protection of the men on our side. Now, supposing they could get their way, or one side could get their way, that protection would leave us free, for instance, to destroy the others, or leave them free to destroy us. Actually, if prayer was effective, it would prevent any of us from destroying anyone else. But is prayer voiced in that sense for that purpose? No. Always the intent is that the other side be destroyed. Now, you know right well that with any concept of God above that of the Hebrew Testament, no one could ever pray God for protection while about some destructive activity. As you begin to think of the many ways in which you have used prayer and the purposes for which you have used prayer, you will see why all these ideas of prayer and God represented only concepts within your being, having no relationship at all to the truth of being, not even distantly related to the truth of being. And that is also true in our metaphysical experience. There is a very good reason why so much of our metaphysical work does not bring forth fruit. There is a very good reason why so many of our metaphysical movements are not doing the healing work that should be done. There is a very good reason why we in the infinite way are not doing the healing works that should be done. It is never because of the teaching that these metaphysicians fail. It is because of the wrong concepts of God and prayer that we entertain in spite of the revelation of God and prayer. Anyone opening their consciousness to truth ultimately will receive it. But the point to be watched is that we do not become frozen, that we do not freeze onto somebody's concept of prayer, somebody's concept of God, and then put our meaning into that. Yes, it's true. John could say, God is love. But immediately that sets up some thought in you of what God is and what love is, and that's where the error comes in. It isn't in the statement that God is love. Undoubtedly it is true if we could know with the soul of John what he meant when he said God is love. Maybe it is true God is love, but God is not love when we start to think of God through our concept of what love is. Now, in this session this morning, I would like to make this one point clear, that in order to be any further advanced spiritually at the end of this week than we are at this moment, it is going to be necessary for us to find a way of shutting out our concepts of God and of prayer. Some way of arriving in consciousness to where we can say, I await within me the unfoldment of God and prayer, and find a way to keep out the intrusion of our former concepts of these subjects. Not one of us here, nor any other place that I know of, has risen high enough in the realization of God and prayer to be entirely satisfied with what we are showing forth in this experience. All of us must make progress in attaining a higher consciousness of God and a higher consciousness of prayer, and that will not be while we are entertaining concepts, ideas, thoughts, and beliefs about God and prayer. Is there a question on this? Let me then give you a suggestion that can be helpful. Anything that you read or hear this week about God or prayer has only one purpose, and that is to wipe out some of the old concepts and raise one into higher concepts. But it is not the answer to this week's work. The answer will come in your realization of this truth, that whatever you are to know about God and prayer must reveal itself to you from within your own being. Now, my function this week, my major function this week, will be the amount of meditation that I can do for us, for our classwork, so that each of us may be lifted up above the atmosphere of mind into the atmosphere of soul, into the consciousness of the soul faculties, so that they may be on a level from which this unfoldment can come. I bring you back for a minute to the Master taking the three disciples to the Mount of Transfiguration. In other words, lifting them into an atmosphere of consciousness where they could behold spiritual reality. He didn't speak to them. He didn't tell them his vision. He took them to the Mount of Transfiguration. He took them to the atmosphere of consciousness. He took them to a height of consciousness where they themselves could discern, witness the presence of the prophets. So with us, we rise in consciousness to a height at which we perceive Moses, Elijah, Elias, Isaiah, Jesus, John, Paul, we observe their degree of unfoldment. In other words, we catch the meaning of the term God is love, or God is ever with us, or I will never leave you nor forsake you. You see, down here on our level, mortal level, human level, a little bit of spiritual level, we catch glimpses of what it means. I will never leave you nor forsake you. It has an entirely different meaning once you apprehend it from the height of the Mount of Transfiguration. Then does it dawn upon you the meaning of I, the I that goes with you, the I that if you go through the waters you will not drown. Go through the flame, fire. The flames will not kindle upon you. There won't even be the smell of smoke. It's a wonderful thing that not only we have these passages in the Gospel of John in the New Testament, we have almost word for word the same gospel in the Hindu Bhagavad Gita. Almost the same wording to the effect that I does not perish with flame, that water cannot drown it, that it is imperishable, and that I never leaves us nor forsakes us. And yet the declaration of that, even the thinking of that thought, is but a preparation for the experience. When the experience comes, then life begins all over again. And it could begin at 40 or 80 or 120, but it does begin all over again when that realization comes from the depth within us. So our real work this week will be climbing that mountain, that Mount of Transfiguration, until we reach that height of consciousness in which spirit defines itself to us. Spirit reveals itself to us in infinite form and variety. And there again you see that it will not wipe out individuality. It will show forth the immortality of individuality, because it will reveal to us the Elijah, the Moses, the Elias of thousands of years ago. It will reveal to us the same state of consciousness here and now within our own being that existed in Galilee or back in the Holy Lands thousands of years before that, way back into India thousands of years before that. It will reveal the immortality of individuality. That is the miracle of the true spiritual realization. That is why it is always said, when some of our students get to the point of saying, since there is nobody to heal, let's stop the healing work and just declare, I am already in heaven. No, we are already in heaven. So is the prodigal son, still the son of his father. But outwardly, he was not manifesting his degree of sonship. He acknowledged that he was having less than his father's servants. And so with us, we today are having much less than our father's servants, and only because we have not yet attained the sonship degree, much less the fatherhood degree. And so, while it is true that we are not going anyplace, while it is true that we are already there, let us acknowledge that consciousness is unfolding and disclosing and revealing the infinite nature of its being progressively and continuously. Does that open any question? Then I'm going to close with this statement. Since no concept of God and no concept of prayer can be truth itself, can be God itself. We today will make every effort in our moments when we're alone, and we will have many hours of being alone during this day. Each one must plan this week to have many hours alone, not even of a communion with each other. Have plenty of the communion with each other, but have plenty of hours alone. Because the major part of our work will be inner revelation that will come to us not always in the moments when we're together, but after having been lifted into the state of consciousness, then give this the opportunity of coming through. Now, since no concept of God or prayer can be true, let us know that the truth about God and prayer must reveal itself to us from within our consciousness. And let us realize that that is our work this week. Now we're going to have more of meditation.